excited for the next practical talk about how to get yourself accepted in medical journals effortlessly. So we're lucky to have Dr. Warren Browner here, who is a professor here in the Department of Epi and Biostats, but more importantly, he's the CEO of CPMC. So really quite a varied career, and was the chief of general medicine at the VA for many years before going on to CPMC. And more importantly, and critically to this talk, has been the executive editor of the American Journal of Medicine previously, as well as being on the editorial board of Journal of General and Internal Medicine. So he's going to tell us secrets from the editorial perspective as to how to best prepare your opus for eventual publication and some of the issues around that. So thanks a lot, Warren, for coming and giving us all the inside information.
So I take it there's no like lavalier, so I have to stand here.
We find a lavalier.
That's okay. And is that the reason everybody sits on this side of the room because the speakers stand here? So there's actually a great paper you should look up in the Journal of Irreproducible Results, which is a real journal, called Phototropism in Swimming Pool Chairs. And it's a picture of how during the course of a day the chairs around a swimming pool at a resort migrate with the sun. It's spontaneously. So I'm assuming that if we move this thing, oh great, everyone would go to the other side. All right, Harry, is this good? Good. So here's what we're going to talk about today, if there's time. If there's not time, we'll only talk about probably the first part. And how much time there is going to depend on two things. How much I digress, which is unpredictable, and how much you ask questions, which is desirable. Okay, so don't worry if we don't get to all of it, because we'll cover most of it. So any questions so far? Practice, everybody raise your hand so I can make sure we don't have, good, no beyond beret. Here we go. So this is a talk about getting your stuff published. And I think it's important to understand that the first thing that happens that you need to understand is what actually goes on in a medical journal. It's a bit of a mystery. You hit the send button. You used to actually have to put things in the mail or FedEx, but those days are dead. But you hit the send button, and then through some mysterious process, eventually your paper either gets accepted or rejected or some other thing. So I think it's really valuable to understand what's going on kind of behind the curtain so that you can help make sure that you get the best possible chance of getting published. So here's the key. For many years, we edited the American Journal of Medicine free journal here at UCSF for 7 years. And I'll tell you, when you're editing a journal, you're caught sort of between two opposite poles. One is you only want to publish really good stuff. You don't want to publish any dreck. And of course, the definition of dreck varies. Like if you're editing a New England Journal, you have a much higher standard for what you're willing to publish than if you're publishing a journal that's read by 200 people and charges $20,000 a year for subscription. But you do want to publish good stuff. The problem you have is that you have a certain number of articles you need to publish in your journal every year because you're coming out every week, every 2 weeks, every month with 5 articles, 10 articles, 20 articles. You do the arithmetic. So you have to produce a pipeline of acceptable articles, even if stuff that comes in isn't as good as you'd like it to be. And there are only literally a handful of journals in the world that get more good stuff than they can possibly publish and wind up having to reject really good stuff. For most journals, it's the exact opposite. They wind up publishing things that they know really aren't so great. So just bear that in mind. Now, the first thing that actually happens at a journal is, of course, your paper gets logged in. That's done completely by administrative staff. Nobody with any professional background is involved in that. The important point there is these people will make sure that you follow all the stuff you're supposed to follow when submitting the article. Make sure they've got a way to contact you, that it's not overly long or whatever it is. And they'll log it in. And then here's the key thing that happens. It gets assigned to an editor. Different journals do this differently. Sometimes they're just assigned if there are 7 editors, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and count it again. Sometimes there are editors, and this is true for most journals, who sort of specialize in one area or more that the journal covers. So for example, the American Journal of Medicine, which is a journal for internal medicine, we had someone who handled all the GI articles, all the cardiology articles, all the pulmonary articles, etc. And then there were a smattering of others that kind of didn't fit into any category that we would somewhat arbitrarily assign. So, this editor who's chosen to deal with the manuscript has a very critical role because they're the sort of the first line of defense against the onslaught of medical submissions. So I'll call this person the screening editor, and they'll get a copy of your article, sometimes just the PDF, sometimes they'll actually get a printed out copy, and they have to make a very important initial decision, which is, do we want to deal with this article or not? And I'll explain what I mean by deal with it in a minute. But very often, in fact, at most journals, the screening process often involves the initial editors looking at it and deciding this is really not appropriate for the journal for a variety of different reasons. It's not worth our time sending it out for review. It's not worth our time without doing anything with it except wishing the authors good luck in another journal. Now, some journals actually require that at least 2 editors look at an article before it's completely rejected, and that really depends on how much money the editorial office has to pay its editors. Because in many cases, the editors are working for essentially very little money or no money. At the fancier, bigger journals, all the editors are paid, and many of them are full-time staff. And so that influences the likelihood that more than one person is going to look at it. So, why am I telling you this? So you understand that there are going to be many times that you submit an article and it gets rejected and you feel personally wounded as if you've been evaluated by the scientific community and found lacking. And in fact, what's probably happened is one person didn't like it. So don't worry too much about that. Now, the other thing that will possibly come as a surprise to you is you've spent probably hundreds of hours preparing your manuscript. Put a ton of work into the study, into writing it up, into making sure it's spelled right, the grammar's good, looks good, et cetera, et cetera. And it is quite possible that this initial review by an editor won't ever read your manuscript. That all they're going to look at is the title and the abstract and maybe the first paragraph or 2 in the introduction. Now, that's why it's so important that the title, the abstract, and the first paragraph or 2 in the introduction be really good, because the editor may not get any further than that. So if the title seems like something that is not very exciting or interesting or novel, and the abstract is hard to get through, and the introduction is not particularly engaging, very few editors will actually have the time or patience to read your entire article. So remember I just said you haven't really been evaluated by the scientific community, it's one person. And it's one person often working from a very limited exposure to the article. Now this may not seem fair to you, it may not seem right to you, but it is the way the process actually works. So, why did I write in name dropping to help you? You want to hazard a guess? I see a head shake. What's your guess? You can't be wrong because you just start now.
The way I think about it is if you have somebody on your list of authors who is well known in the field, it might help get beyond the sort of initial screening.
Yes, it's much. If you submitted an article yourself with nobody with any name recognition, the likelihood that an editor is actually going to spend more time with it is lower than if you have somebody whose name they actually recognize. Now, what if you're not working with somebody whose name is well known in the field? A technique, and the reason I bring it up here, that you can use is to, in the cover letter, write the name of somebody who suggested that you submit it to that particular journal, right? So you could suggest that Peter thought it would fit perfectly in an infection or something. Everyone follow? So what you're trying to do is get past that initial screening step. And one of the ways to do it is to provide the editor a reason to go to the next step. Now, why might you get a no vote right away? So that I've got this little mnemonic. How many of you are fans of mnemonics? Really? Because I'm surprised when I was in medical school sitting in this room 35 years ago, if there was no mnemonic associated with it, it wasn't important. So, do you know the Frank Sinatra mnemonic? Really? All right, ready? This is, I think, the best mnemonic in all of medicine. Is, see if I can remember it. Frank Sinatra takes 4/5 Seagram 7 every night to ease tension. Frank Sinatra takes 4/5 Seagram 7 every night to ease tension. And that's the mnemonic for the cranial nerves. First, second, third, fourth. See? We have much less to do. All right, so here's the mnemonic. Training. So these are the most common reasons why manuscripts get rejected right away, and I'll go through all of them in a minute. So, this is very sensitive. All right, too much trouble. So if the manuscript just is like really long, dense, and overwhelming, and it's an obscure topic, none of the editors can think of anybody to review it. What's also going off in their mind is nobody is actually ever going to read it. Not gonna pass. Not relevant. So you really, this is where you submit it completely to the wrong journal. Where that the science, even though it's beautiful, doesn't really advance the field. Not appropriate. You send in a review article to a journal that doesn't publish review articles. That's not going to work. Not interesting and not novel. These are the hardest to actually self-evaluate on, because almost by definition, if you've been working on something for a couple of years, you find it interesting and you think it's novel. So it's quite disappointing to discover that no one else agrees with it. But what I'll tell you is that if you get a quick rejection, that's the second best possible outcome you can get. Best being, we want to accept your article. But a quick rejection just means you get back on the horse and you submit it somewhere else. The worst thing that can happen is that you go through the cycle of submitting and resubmitting, and then eventually it gets rejected anyway. So don't worry too much if you send in an article and it gets rejected straight off. You've saved yourself a lot of time and effort, and basically all you need to do is find the other journal to submit. Sometimes, however, it takes a long time. I've said a month or more. I mean, I'm sure you've had articles that sat in a journal for 2 or 3 months, and then they finally come back rejected with really not much. So why might that happen? So editors are infallible. They also have lots of other things to do. And I can tell you that when you're editing a journal, the manuscripts just literally pile up on the desk or your inbox. And it becomes sort of an intimidating task to deal with them. And particularly if the manuscript requires a little bit extra thought, you may just keep putting it off, and then when you finally get to it, you realize, gee whiz, it's not really something we're going to consider. This is something you can help with. You want to make it as easy as possible for the editor to be able to figure out what the manuscript is about, is it important, who might be able to review it. So if the editor looks at something and says, gee whiz, I was just in a meeting and I just heard about TRF2. I don't remember what it is, but I think it might be important. And they've got to look something up. That's another reason why things will slow down. So you can help them by clarifying the introduction why something is important. The bottom of the pile, so that's the manuscripts no one ever really wants to deal with. Kind of like a patient on your service that you know is always going to complain, so you always visit them late in the day. when you're already really tired because you're putting it off, and that just makes it worse. It's the same basic principle. What's unusual is that the editors actually disagree. So editors know in general what their journal is looking for, and we get pretty good concordance about, yeah, this is something we want to review, or this is something we just want to send back. Question? So what happens on the other end if you don't get rejected initially, then what's the process and what's involved? So the editor who's got your article, who you should think of at this point as your advocate, because they're going to be your best chance of getting the article published. So they've got the article, they're assigned to it, and they need to get reviewers for it. It is a standard practice at all medical journals to get peer review. The thought being that editors are not expert enough in every area to be able to give an article a thorough review for a variety of different aspects, like technical aspects, importance. Is somebody else already doing this work, etc. Now, the most common way that reviewers are selected is if most journals have a database of people who reviewed for the journal previously with keywords. And in a journal that has real staff, the staff will actually do a keyword search and suggest 5 or 6 editors, maybe even 10 or 15 5 or 6 reviewers to the editor. But it's also possible that the editor just looks at it and thinks, oh, gee whiz, Mary should review this. I know she knows a lot about it. And so the closer the reviewer is to the editor, and I mean closer both geographically and also as a colleague, the more likely they are to actually get the article to review. For another reason too, which is editors have a hard time getting reviewers to say yes to articles. So it's much easier to send an article out for review to someone you work with, or who's a colleague or a friend, because they'll have a harder time saying no when they see your name as the editor on the please review this article list. Because good reviewers will get asked to review 50, sometimes even 100 manuscripts a year. Particularly if you're working in an area where there's lots of science happening. And there's really no way that a reviewer can actually provide that kind of service to that many articles. Usually most journals want to get 2 to 4 reviewers to agree to review the article and actually send in their reviews. And since maybe 1 in 4 people contacted actually agrees, you can see it can take a long time just to find these people. So you make a list of an initial list of 4 people, send off an email asking them to review, then you got to wait for them to decide. Let's say 3 of them said no, so you've got 1 that you're still trying to find 2 or 3 more, send it out to another 5 or 6 reviewers, etc. The process can actually take several weeks just to identify the reviewers. And then, of course, the reviewers actually have to read the article and review it. That's another issue. This can take a really long time if you're writing about something that's unusual, where there's a limited number of people who feel comfortable actually reviewing it, and it can be hard for the editors to actually find people. So should you suggest reviewers in your cover letter? I would like to suggest Roberta, Ann, Landon, and Joe to review this article. They're experts in the field. They weren't involved in any of the work. They've not seen the article before, and I think they'd be good reviewers. That's not an uncommon thing to happen. But what you should understand about doing this is that this can completely backfire on you, right? Because if you suggest someone to review the article, and then they don't think the article is particularly worthwhile, you're helping to dig your own grave. So just be aware that there are both pros and cons of suggesting reviewers. Almost all journals will respect a request that someone not review the article. So if you know that there's a lab or a research group that you don't think should be reviewing your article for whatever reason, you should tell the editors, but you should tell them the reason. So it's not enough to say, I don't think, John Smith should review the article. You have to say, John Smith, is working on a similar project, and I don't think he would give an unbiased review. Or I used to work in John Smith's lab, and we had an argument over X, Y, and Z. And I think almost all editors will follow this request. And even if they don't, they will take that into account when they're evaluating the review that comes back from John Smith. So, questions about this? Okay. The other thing I wanted to say is if you're going to suggest somebody in particular, please provide up-to-date contact information so that the editor and the editorial staff can get a hold of this person expeditiously. All right. So how many of you have ever reviewed an article? Okay, so you should do this. I assume all of you are working with a mentor or somebody claims to be your mentor. Is that correct? So you should really ask them next time you get an article to review, could I help you? I mean, it's really a valuable thing to do. It's a really important part of the learning process for how to become a scientist, particularly in medicine. So what happens is the reviewer is sent the article or sent the link to the article, which they then have to download and usually print and read. And in general, that's not the highest priority that reviewers have. It's probably not even in the top 10. So usually what happens is a week before the reviews due, or in some cases 2 weeks before the reviews due, because most journals give you about a month to review an article, the reviewer will get a reminder email. And there's about a 50-50 chance that they'll even remember that they agreed to review the article or to consent on it. Because so much has transpired. So just the process of getting the reviews back, even after people have reviewed the article, can be quite cumbersome and difficult. And reviewers are asked to comment in all sorts of ways about the manuscript. How good is the science? How original is the science? Is it relevant to the people who read the journal, etc.? What you need to understand is that there are two sets of comments that the reviewers make. There are confidential comments to the editors, and then there are comments that the editors are authorized to pass on to you, the author. And they can be as different as night and day. So the comments to the editor might be, I didn't spend much time with this manuscript, there's really not much there. Okay. That's a kiss of death kind of comment. But the comments to you might be, I really have nothing to suggest. You might think, oh, I really liked it. Or, particularly if you're a young investigator, you may get a long list of what you see as addressable comments, because the reviewer is trying to be helpful, and the confidential comment to the editor would be, I didn't even really know where to begin, but I suggested a few things that would make the manuscript better. So just be aware that there is often not a perfect correlation, there's usually not a perfect correlation between those two sets of comments, particularly from young reviewers. Reviewers who have done it for a long time or have been editors themselves know better than to put biting comments in the confidential comments and leave that unclear to the author. They may soften the comments, they should soften the comments, but a good reviewer won't mislead the authors into thinking that he or she really liked their article. Now,
Question.
yeah, oh, sorry.
I'm curious, from your experience, reviewers, how familiar are they with this subject matter that they're actually reviewing?
Yeah, that's the famous it depends. So what I will tell you is that most reviewers are more familiar with the subject matter than the editor who sent them the article. Okay? Now, are they going to be nearly as familiar with it as you would like them to be? Probably not, but maybe. And that's part of the reason, if you're in an unusual field, suggesting people who could actually comment intelligently on an article is really critical. Otherwise, the editor may not even understand or know who the experts in the field are. But yeah, one of the things you can often tell from your review is that the reviewers didn't really understand the article, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. What to do if that's the case. Now, there is unbelievable variability in the quality. Oh, sorry, question?
How do you kind of read between the lines?
Yeah, we'll get to the read between lines. Coming up. If I don't cover it in a few slides, let me know. So there is unbelievable variability among reviewers. And editors know that. Good editors won't send an article to 3 reviewers they know don't actually provide much feedback, just do a sort of an overall assessment of the article. But lots of times, as an editor, you're actually sending the article to someone you don't know, and they've never reviewed for you or the journal before, and you don't really know what to expect. Good editors weigh the quality of the review in terms of how they make decisions. So there is some discounting of really hostile reviews. It's obvious that the reviewer had something in for you, or more likely in for your mentor, since presumably they have no reason to have an argument with mentors. But good editors will discount those and not pay as much attention. But this is the single most common misconception that people who write and submit articles have, is they assume that the reviewers are making the decision about whether or not to accept the manuscript. In part, that's because one of the questions that reviewers usually answer, they check a box with a recommendation, accept, revise and reconsider, extensive revisions, reject. So even many reviewers think that they're just making the decision about whether or not the manuscript is acceptable. But I will tell you, the better the journal, the less that's true. And all the really good journals, the final decisions are made entirely by the editors and the editorial board. The reviewers' comments are just advisory, which is incredibly frustrating if you're an author, because you may get back 2 glowing reviews, and it's clear that that both reviewers really liked it and thought it was important. And the editors decided it's a really well done study, but the topic isn't important for our readers. You might say to yourself, well, they should have realized that before they sent it out for review, but that isn't really the way it works. So it's really important that reviewers can't nix an article, nor can they accept an article. And your job as a reviewer is to remember that what you're doing is influencing the editors. So if you think an article is really good, it's not enough to say, this is a really good article, it's revolutionary, it's going to change your understanding of the field. You need to say why. We did, before I saw this article, we didn't understand A, B, and C, and this article clarifies it. That's if you think the article is good. If you think the article is really not good, you have to explain exactly why. 50% of the patients with Boston followed an unacceptable rate for a study looking at quality of life as an outcome, whatever it is. But remember that it's up to the editors to make the final decision. So what do you do while you're waiting? So you sent your article in, and you've gotten that. Thank you so much for submitting your article. We sent it out for peer review. We'll be in contact with you in about 6 weeks. It's a miracle, by the way, if you get contacted again in 6 weeks. So this is a very anxiety-producing time for you. In the old days, you used to have to pick up the phone and call the journal office to find out what was going on. Now, of course, you can just go online. And I will tell you this, what many journals do is that we amuse ourselves by looking at which article has been checked for its status the most frequently. Because there are people who check 3 or 4 times a day. No, really. And so, after 30 days, there are 100 different visits to a little spot. It doesn't really matter if you do that. If it's helping you alleviate some of your anxiety, great. It's not going to influence the chances the article is accepted